So what might have happened to Corryn Rayney? Lloyd thinks it's most likely that she was abducted from the car park at Bentley Community Hall when she left bootscooting. Police alleged she made it home to Como and was killed there by Lloyd. Which is it? Well, when Corinne's body was taken out of the ground, obviously there'd be a lot of evidence there, specifically botanical and mineral, okay? Perth is sandy. It's all sand everywhere you go. You don't, it's very, curbs just sort of blend into sand. There's very little grass or walls or things like that. It's a very strange sort of area, and new subdivisions, they just excavate out dune after dune after dune. And so you might think to dig a grave in a park, it's going to be really difficult, but it's very loamy. It's sandy soil. So, and there was 3 kilos of soil in Corinne's body bag when her autopsy and then forensic evidence was being looked at. So investigators wanted forensic pathologists to change details. They possibly planted a seed pod. Kings Park, obviously everything has a really specific habitat, right, and ecology. So with Corinne were all these things that show where she died, for example. In nasal passages, a pathologist shows that the pollens and things found there prove Corinne died at the park. So sure, she could have just been unconscious and transferred to Kings Park and then killed there. But the evidence on her body was from Kings Park and not from her home in Como, except there was a seed pod apparently discovered. This globe of a seed pod from an amber tree. There was an amber tree at Kings Park nearby, but why wouldn't the amber seed pod, a spiky little thing, why wouldn't it have sand and soil and other bits and pieces from Kings Park caught up in it? It simply didn't, and instead seemed to come from a tree at the home in Como. And the forensic pathologist who supports Lloyd says it's impossible that this seed pod be found in there without evidence from the site, without having sand from Kings Park caught up in it, without having, some sort of pollens, leafy material, anything at all linking that pod to Kings Park. And therefore her conclusion is that that pod was placed as planted evidence And I guess this is what some people would believe the man in the gold car was doing, finding something to plant with Corinne to ensure that her body being in Kings Park is linked to being at the home in Como. Because when you look at the critical information log, within the first 48 hours, it's overwhelmingly devoted to all things Lloyd and not really much else. There's the issue of timing. I will run through some times for you later, but you know, just for the sake of things now, it's easiest if I say from Como to Bentley it's 10 minutes, from Como to where the concert was is 10 minutes, although you've got the concert traffic, etc. From Como to Kings Park, 10 minutes. It's all sort of within a certain space, right? And there is a way that you can work out the times where Lloyd could have committed the crime, but there's no evidence of this, and it would be very tricky, and few things would have to have happened. But who might have been able to commit the crime? Well, there's one person called Allon Lacco, and he's a scumbag. He's a violent sexual offender, and I won't go into some of his crimes because one of them is extremely heinous. It involves a young person. He lived in an apartment building overlooking the Bentley Community Centre, and he used to sell drugs in the car park there. So this is interesting because he could very well have seen Corinne and have planned to abduct, assault and murder her in advance. She was a very attractive woman. She would have made quite the cutting figure, you know, in her tight jeans, her cowgirl boots, and her western shirt, and her long hair, walking out of boot scooting class and probably cheerily waving goodbye to people, feeling in an uplifted mood. She probably exuded confidence and attractiveness, but possibly also some vulnerability, especially if distracted and with her mind on what's to happen when she gets home, the conversation she's going to have. Was she paying as much attention as she should have been to her surroundings? Did she take care to park her car as close to the building as possible? Maybe she liked to park further away. It was quite a new car. It was a 2005 model. Did she not want to park where anyone might accidentally scrape the car? You know, this isn't safety procedure, woman. Okay, you park close, you park under a light, you get walked to your vehicle. Okay, but as it happened on the night of 7th of August 2007, Corinne said her goodbyes at about 9:30, but not one of the 30 witnesses, the boot scooting crowd, not one of them could say that they saw her get in her car and drive off. And I think it's likely that maybe she left a little bit early, because if she was going to have this conversation with Lloyd, maybe she needed to leave a bit early. Maybe she had agreed to 9:30 and was leaving at 9:20, and perhaps everyone else was inside still mingling. They've seen her leave and walk into the car park, but they themselves haven't. And so someone like Allon Mitchell Lacco could easily have just grabbed her, gotten into her car and driven off. Very easy. An interesting thing about this sicko is that I think it was one of his I can't remember who he told, one of his comrades said when they were in Kings Park in July, he points, there's a body going in there, which is pretty chilling. And he also disappeared to South Australia 8 days after Corryn's body was exhumed. Well, actually, 8 days after the murder, he had gone to South Australia the day after Corinne was found. Now, what have I written here? There was a knife in his car. There was sand in his car, and he, when he was arrested, wasn't arrested. The day after Corinne was found, Lacco was pulled over and there was sand in his car, there was a knife in his car, and he asks them about the Bentley carjack. Okay, I need to look more into this because now that I come to speak to you about it, I know that he went to South Australia, so I'm not sure what the story is with him being pulled over, why he wasn't arrested, or what this was about. What would have happened if Corinne wasn't found? And then there would have just been these rumours, I guess, circulating around Lacco and the things that he said. Would people have tried to search in Kings Park and still found her? The trial went for 12 weeks. There were 100 witnesses, 700 exhibits, and one of them being that unnatural seed pod. It was unnatural because the pod, as I said, had no soil or sand, and it was believed to be a plant. So the forensic pathologist was asked to change a report by the police. The police were found to have acted unlawfully, destroying evidence and attempting to pervert the course of justice. Police and forensic evidence was consistent with a sexual assault, and 2 criminals were identified. Lacco was one of them. Another one was one of Lacco's cousins, who's since disappeared. No one knows where he is. Consistent with sexual assault, and 2 criminals were identified who should have been investigated as intensely as Lloyd was. So that was what Lloyd based his defamation case on, and the police lost the case, and the defamation case was based on, I guess, what Jack Lee did. He named Lloyd early on as the one and only suspect. And a review before the defamation case, a review of the cold case that was carried out, it brought no new information to light whatsoever. So Lloyd won his defamation case, and he's, sort of just trying to move on with his life in Perth, while a lot of people think that he murdered Corinne. So, of course, and just for information's sake, how operations are named, the investigation into Corinne's disappearance and subsequent murder was Operation Dargan, Dargan. So what do you think? I mean, it's one of these cases where there's a lot of the circumstantial evidence, one might say, because you've got a couple whose marriage is more than just on the rocks. It's for all intents and purposes over, and all that's left to do is to work out the financial situation and to come to some sort of agreement about custody. You have a man who would certainly have knowledge, perhaps, of how to carry out a murder, where to put a body, and, but again, for all intents and purposes, Lloyd Rayney appeared to be extremely cooperative with police in the first instance. He provided, he was the one that pursued the avenues toward unlocking all of Corinne's emails so that police had access to everything, and it seems that he was home with one of his daughters, was seen at home again, and couldn't possibly have been driving around taking Corinne to Kings Park and returning, or could he? He also, there's allegations that, he could have hired someone, okay? But there's no record of any payment, any funds moving around anywhere. Well, would there have to be? If Lloyd's a gambler, how is he getting money out? Could be cash flying around all over the place. And strangely, Lacco had a map of the Supreme Court where Corinne worked, and a map of Kings Park. He used to work at Kings Park, maybe as a groundsman or some such, I'm not sure. So he knew the terrain, he knew the tracks. So was there some sort of collaboration? Was Lloyd paid? Why wouldn't he speak up about it when pressured? He's never stated anything of the sort. But he's an extremely seedy character. Now, just because he's just an extremely seedy character who makes money selling drugs, doesn't mean he wouldn't be able to maybe find out more about Corinne. He could have been watching and lurking for a long time. He could have known that she worked at the Supreme Court, maybe. I don't know. He could have heard talk between her and bootscooting friends, you know. Maybe he wanted to abduct her from the Supreme Court. Why would he have a map of the Supreme Court, though? That's very odd, isn't it? Was he being given options by someone who wanted him to abduct Corinne? I mean, it might seem that bootscooting would be the best possible place to do it. It's interesting to note that there's a golf course in between the golf club in between Bentley and Como. Why not just take her to the golf club and assault her and leave her there? You know, but if he's worked in Kings Park and if it's true what he stated about there's a body going in there, did he know that this was a much better solution? Because, you know, Corinne probably wouldn't be found. Of course, he drove over, the person driving her car away drove over the bollard. It's interesting to note, Subiaco, he's driving in the opposite direction of returning home to Bentley. Why would he want to drive her car towards Bentley, I guess? You know, so was the grave pre-dug? It actually wouldn't take as long as you imagine to dig the hole because of the loamy soil, the sand that's in the soil. So just because Corinne's car wasn't seen at home when Caitlin was returned doesn't mean that it wasn't there, because it could have been parked around the back of the house. Inviting the friend and the friend's mother in could have all been a bluff, a ruse, knowing that they'd confuse, that it's late, that it was a school day the next day. And that they just want to head home and get to bed. So, I mean, let's say Corinne's at bootscooting. What would be the time frame for someone to take her to Kings Park? Well, actually, they'd pretty much need to drive through Como. So we could say bootscoot, either at home at Como at 9:40. She could well have been abducted from there. And even if it was by someone like Lacco, if he maybe knew she worked at the Supreme Court, maybe he had found out where she lived at 6 Monash Street in Como. So 9:40 through Como, 9:50 at the park, 9:50 to the grave site, 10:25 to leave, 10:30 at Kershaw Street in Subiaco where the car was abandoned. If the mother got home, Lloyd, if there was a car somewhere in Subiaco, or if he called a cab, no one ever came forward to say he was given a ride. But, you know, look, he could have made it home because it's 15 minutes from Subiaco to his house in Como. Or did he take her after the return of his daughter when both daughters were in bed, then leave the home, drive to Kings Park? And is this the correct timeline? At 11 p.m, it's reported by a person in an apartment building overlooking Kings Park that they heard a scream for 2 minutes, a scream. And that's at 11. So if, say, Lacco or any abductor had taken Corinne at 9:30 and had got into Kings Park by about 9:50 and a scream's heard at 11, have they made her, was she unconscious or was she watching them dig her grave? You know, had they already perhaps assaulted her? Was she unconscious? Was the grave pre-dug? And then, you know, if it's Lloyd, he's then somehow gotten back again unnoticed. So they're trying to say, police were trying to say that Lloyd, who was shorter than his wife, I believe, and he definitely weighed less. This doesn't mean a man isn't wiry and strong, okay? But a dead weight, and certainly one of 74 kilos, is difficult to lift, particularly to get into a car. Maybe, and there's drag marks on her boots. But perhaps she didn't get out of the car when she was attacked. Perhaps she was in the car when she was attacked. She didn't need to be lifted in. And how would Lloyd, you know, get home from the park? He could have connected with Lacco through work, through knowing unseemly people. Indeed, he was in prison with pedophiles and, as he says, you know, with the predators, the pedophiles, the unsavory people for 16 days under arrest on charges of the surveillance crimes. He could have made connections anywhere. And I just find, you know, is it just circumstantially interesting that he's humiliated in July about the marriage breakdown. Lacco says a body is going in the ground in Kings Park. He says that in July. And the allegations against him about sleeping in his daughter's beds are made in July. So was he planning to commit Corinne to the ground for that period of time throughout July to the first week of August? There's other things that really entrench the idea of Lloyd's guilt, but that were dismissed by the judge as not being that type of evidence that shows beyond a reasonable doubt anything at all. One very interesting thing was Lloyd had attended, because in Kings Park is one place that I went, and the centre there, the entertainment centre there is really amazing. I think it was quite new at the time, actually, when I went there. He had attended an event. Lots of people saw him there. And at these events, you know, you have your place card with your name. and it had the name of the event. And this was found in the park, not too far from Corinne's body. Lloyd's explanation was, oh, well, I took Corinne's car to the event, so of course it's blown out, it's come out of the car into the park. Now, this card could have found its way into the car at any time and therefore fallen out. But the interesting thing is that the witnesses who were at the dinner state that Lloyd did not arrive in his wife's white 2005 Ford Fairmont. It was a bold lie. Was it just because he was frightened of how this evidence might appear? He already felt so hounded. Or was he just trying to cover up the fact that there was this business card at the site? How would it be there? Was his car there? How did it get there? Did he throw it away after the dinner? Did it fly out of a rubbish bin and just lodge itself somewhere in the park? You know, it's weird. Does it mean that Lloyd murdered his wife? No. What's the explanation? So, you know, these are it's just so interesting, you know, these types of details. The strangeness of the seed pod. The lie of Lloyd explaining this card. I mean, he could have just said, yeah, but I walked out with it and I threw it away. He could have said, I often am driving through Kings Park. I do this at lunchtime. I'm there all the time, you know. It's where I have lunch, or it's where, you know. And indeed, you know, the fact is that there could be so many explanations. I wonder how many other people's place cards from that dinner are floating around in the park. Only one person's wife was murdered and was found there, though, right? So it's extremely interesting to ponder, you know. Extremely interesting to ponder, you know, this information about the Ford Fairmont versus the Range Rover and the DNA, you know. Corinne's boot scooting versus Suzanne's bicycling. The affair